19 High Plains Meddler. The limp forms of warriors surrounded her. Her bronzed body gleamed in the brutal southwestern sunlight, even more intimidating in waking reality. Like in dream, she went nude, at least here, with the sole difference that today, she sported a small aqua witch cap on the crown of her head, highlighting her witchiness just that little bitty bit. It was plain she had. Warning, empty page. Defeated all these warriors without much difficulty, and now she was standing proud, her mighty body radiating confidence. But the muscle witch wasn't alone. Across from the pile, a warrior equal in size and muscle was leering. All the Yetaiglanchans wore heavy Kayatefer clothing, but this figure looked like he could have been the one to put coyotes on the endangered species list. His muscular body was wrapped mummy-style from neck to ankle in coyote hides. The preserved heads of the beasts popped through the wrapping all over, giving him the appearance of a monster with animal heads growing out of its body. His own head was adorned with a cap made of not one, not two, but 3 preserved coyote heads. His visage could best be described as pointy. He turned to the interlopers with a pointed stare. "It looks," said Drip Dry, "like you're about to attack the good woman after she's just expended her energy. What a roguish churl." He cocked his head cockily and licked his chops. Replied the man. "We do not need outsiders interfering in our affairs. Leave, foreigner, you are not welcome. Outside meddlers are filthy scum. Do not interfere in our affairs. We will not tolerate your meddling." "What affairs," asked Barry, "and what meddling, do you speak of? You dishonor the Yetaiglanchan name with these baseless accusations. We're just coming through to visit your fair land and treat the fight lovers among you to some displays of fair and sportsmanlike wrestling. We have neither motive nor desire to dash." "We have no need of your lies. Do not meddle. Leave desertate council business to the true people. You know nothing. Listenin' to this asshole," Pardoilios muttered side-mouthed, "feels like I'm knowing less and less by the second." The Yetaiglanchan hardy evidently heard this, because he pointed a sharp finger of his powerful hand at Pardoilios with a fresh round of the AAAA routine. Then, something frightful, his eyes took on a baleful deep red tint, and at the same time, so did the eyes of all the many preserved coyote heads popping out from his vestments. And the heads began to voicelessly yammer and yap, with a gnashing of jaw and a clanking of tooth that was audible, noisy to the ear, the bone, the nerves, the very blood of the listener. And though they had no voices, their voiceless cry from beyond the grave was more arresting than any audible cry could have been, more palpable, more viscerally transcendental in its disrespect of the laws of steady nerves, healthy heart, and good clean common sense. It raised the hairs on all who heard it. But San was losing patience with the theatrics. "Put up your dukes, Dick Cheese," she said to the warrior, pointing her own finger in challenge. The Yetaiglanchan let out a gurgly noise that must have been some sort of effort to imitate the snarling of a coyote. Then he pounced. That was the word for it, flying through the air at a low arc, with hands/paws outstretched, as one ready to rend flesh. A look of tranquility passed across San's brow as she put her hands palm forward in front of her stomach in a chi blast posture. Lured into a false sense of security, the warrior grinned stupidly. Just as he entered range, San let loose a devastating uppercut. 3 coyote heads were knocked to the side as the mighty witch fist tore open the chest of the macabre garment. Chest flesh rippled under the impact. The witch fist continued on its path, knocking into the jaw, which rattled horridly. The warrior flew into the air, pushed back with greater force than he had leapt, a loose tooth flying free behind him. He landed in the dust with a dull thud. The wind whipped around with the turbulence of the action, then all was still. Pardoilios whistled. "San," Barry called, approaching after he had turned to check that the wagon was still untampered with. "What are you doing here?" "I live here." "Oh. I remember reading speculations that you were a hermit somewhere in the great southwestern deserts, but as there was no basis in fact, I filed such notions to the back of my mind. But surely it can't be a total coincidence that, in all this great desert land wilderness, we should happen upon one another. I mean, I guess it could be, Drip Dry said. Not bloody likely. Pardoilio said in a miserable imitation of a Britland accent. I knew you clowns would be in this area. I was sustainably gathering ingredients like normal, but I came this way for two main reasons. One was to warn you guys that these tribes are crazy these days and you need to watch out, because they think everybody is trying to meddle in their affairs. Don't ask me what affairs they think are so important that anyone would want to meddle in them, but it's gotta have something to do with the political disputes. They've connected to the Rumble for some reason, I don't know, I really don't understand any of it. All so stupid. The other main reason is that I noticed you guys are a total sausage fest caravan. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's sausage fests. So I'm agreeing to join you, for this reason alone. Barry expertly hid his smugness. Of course that's what this is. San Wordle isn't someone who would set up the excellent Club Bazaar system of communication based on her own researches and the cognizance that this trip was important, and then simply leave it at that. Everything I've read paints her as hands-on. She wants in on the action. Aloud he said, excellent. You should be a tremendous asset. I trust you've considered the issue of attire? It pains me to have to say it, but polite society, ignorant of the witchly powers that you can better harness for the good of the species when nude, will probably insist on some covering. As an asshole, you naturally have a formidable expertise in how most people think, said San. Also, you can use the word Wiccan instead of calling everything witchly if you want to sound less stupid. Just an option. Yes, I've got a smock frock and some other stuff. There's room for a moderate-sized pack in that shitty little wagon. It's pretty lousy, I admit, said Drip Dry, self-conscious of his purchase, but it won't be much longer before we meet up with Barry's boys and can transfer into their wagon. This hunko junk should take us to West Pueblo City. There's plenty of room. It will be a pleasure to have your company. In the dry southwestern heat, he couldn't even make an effort to hide the wagging of his tongue. Confluence Gulch was a pleasant sight. After days of nothing but wasteland and bare-bones outposts, it did the trio from Galvanite good to see a genuine community, even if a small and far-flung one, spread out in the valley below them. I get here from time to time, said San, now seated relaxedly in the wagon with her huge grey sleeveless smock frock draped over her form. Mostly good people, as people generally go. The town was indeed situated at the confluence of two dry deep gulches, wide enough, it appeared, to hold a prodigious amount of water before spilling over. It would take a massive rainfall to endanger the town, despite the unabsorbent soil. There was hilly country in every direction. Surrounding the small town on all the sides not bordered by the gulches, little desert gardens flourished. It must have taken hard work and a prodigious green thumb, Barry reflected, to get such a yield from this land. A hardy folk indeed must inhabit it. The town center was much like the outposts in general layout, but had a totally different feel to it, on account of the greater love with which the architecture of even the simplest administrative office was imbued. The inn had a homey but festive appearance. Barry suspected some good eating in his near future, albeit of a humbler sort than the gourmet luxuries of the deeper Southlands. In the town's very center sat a statue of Fidge, the littlest demigod, patron of magnanimity. I could live in a place like this, said Pardoilios. Say that, said San, and watch yourself get bored in the first few days. I'm from Galvanite. You could live in a place like this, concurred San. San, said Barry as they pulled into the town's outskirts, what brought you to the southwest? I'm literally from the southwest. Are you associated with any of the tribes? Asked Drip Dry. Nope. I'm actually from a smaller tribe, one of the ancient ones that traces its ancestry in this land much farther back. I don't really understand what's up with the Desiccation Council. It sure isn't like anything from ancient days that I've heard of. There's definitely no real meaningful connection between them and the ancients, genetic or otherwise. These newer tribes have their own screwy ideas. You saw that absolute idiot in his coyote Halloween costume. That's not a good use for magic. I'm not what you might call a tribal personality type anyway. I mainly keep to myself and my own practices, like most arcane researchers. Then, asked Barry, your witchcraft doesn't borrow much from your ancient ancestry. Coincidentally, said San, even though I never said anything remotely like that, it's probably a fair statement. My approach tends to focus on what works, regardless of source. The one thing that my historical researches into the ancients has influenced heavily, however, is how I view the role of central government. I don't know how much history you've read, but I'm leaving you to form your own conclusions on all that. The wagon was trundling into the town proper, the speed mules emitting an air of anticipation, as if they could already taste the trough. A stable hand helpfully came out to guide them into the docking area for the Ol Gulch Inn, which had a fair business going, by the looks of things. Good thing we didn't get here too much later, said Pardoilios, or the crowd for the rumble might have pushed us out of town with no space left. The wagoneers nodded. I wish, said Barry, we could just stay a day, but Marcel and the remaining T-towners are already waiting for us. It's not even dinner time yet. I'll go grab supplies so we can head out first thing. Everyone might wanna let me top up your canteens, just in case. The group, minus San who hadn't even had time to get thirsty, gave him their bottles, which he slung around his shoulders. While the rest headed into the saloon for refreshments, Barry strode towards the town center. The fountain was close by the statue of Fidge. Barry admired it. Fascinating it appeared to be formed out of gabbro. The dark, slightly greenish figure was the only demigod smaller than Finklin. There was undoubtedly a sense of magnanimity in the jolly figure, with his stout build, plain clothes, massive, flowing beard and wide smile. This was the being they called the Fiddler of the Mountain. But not the type of mountain around here. It would have felt less out of place in the great mountain ranges to the north. Perhaps an early leader of the town had been an acolyte. He began to fill the canteens as the vision flowed. Fidge. Fiddler of the Mountain. Grant me your might? The man stood at the confluence of two gulches. His family was huddled behind him. He brandished a pickaxe. The coyote riders had him cornered. This was a lost tribe that Barry knew of only dimly, ugly pockmarked mutants that rode giant albino coyotes and attacked their targets with slings and spears. But the three riders who had cornered the small family had run out of sling stones. Now they closed in with their vicious barbed flint spears. A pickaxe was a particularly poor weapon in this fight. The man prayed to his god. And the light of inspiration shone down upon him. He flung the pickaxe. It was a miracle. With incredible force, 1, 2, 3, it spun through the air like a boomerang and crashed through the chests of all three giant coyotes, shoving their massive hearts out of their bodies as it burst through the other side. The stink of blood filled the air as the gory implement of havoc spun dripping back to the man's waiting hand. This is the power, you scum. The power of the Fiddler of the Mountain. The power of magnanimity. The hideous riders bereft of their steeds witnessed the fury of the man's countenance. And they hightailed it? We will eat coyote tonight. And let this spot be sacred, sacred to the grace of Fidge and the memory of his mighty and magnanimous deeds. People will come here, travelers who are weary as we, and ready for a place to rest and to call home. We will erect a statue the color of the dusk, the holy dusk that now closes on the miracle of this day. And in this confluence gulch, let every day be holy. And let the people grow strong and straight and steady, and be mighty. Barry looked around. The people walked about their business. And they looked mighty enough. He walked to the general store, went in, browsed. These canned beans will do for today, friend. Any thoughts on this rumble coming up in the big city? The shopkeeper, a wizened yet keen-featured geezer with long hair, long beard, and longish mustache, sighed. I hope it leads to the resolution of some difficult issues. And mark my words, fellow. If you know what's good for you, you won't meddle in affairs of the Desiccation Council. From whence come you? Why are you here? Why ask such questions, and why should we trust you? My good fine fellow man friend. I was making small talk. It never hurts to be well informed. But, naturally, I expected that you wouldn't want to tell me, a stranger, anything secret, anything that wasn't simply common knowledge in your area. That goes without saying. I haven't the slightest desire to meddle in the affairs of anybody, least of all the Desiccation Council. As to why you should trust me, I'm not running for any kind of public office. I have no need to win over your hearts and minds, if it were conceded that such were possible, which I frankly doubt it is regardless of my conduct, with the approach you show. Me and my allies are simple wrestling entertainers. Meddle not, foreign stranger. The shopkeep's eyes widened as if he were the grande potentate of the realm, dispensing judgment. Let the Grand Desiccation Council elders follow their wisdom, for our ways are not your ways. We do not trust meddlers. May I have the change from my purchase? Barry trudged back to the wagon to load the provisions, hoping they would be secure enough from potential nighttime thieving. It was plain that anyone associated with the tribes of the Desiccation Council was at least slightly mad. The provenance of this strange neurosis, bordering on a mania in its deeper stages, was something he'd be fascinated to learn about. But he was in the dark right now. He could only question as he normally would, and when the issue of meddling came up, change the subject or, perhaps better, end the conversation. Evening was just starting to dim the sky. It would be good to relax after the tedium of road travel. He went into the saloon. This was a homier place, a place that catered not only to a good volume of travelers, but to a fair volume of locals as well. As a result, it felt much less put on than most outpost saloons, even the humbler ones. It was a brown, warmly lit and reasonably smoky place, with a bass hum of chatter and a super sinewy ultra-wizened mega-geezer maniacally fiddling away in a corner, backed up by a small band. Barry found his group. "That old boy can fiddle to beat the devil," said Pardoilios. San yawned. "I do admire his deft acumen," said Drip Dry, "but the whining noise that fiddle makes could get to you after a while." "I dare say," agreed Barry. "I'm getting a ginseng tea, anyone want me to grab them something?" Committing the orders to memory, he stepped up to the cozy mahogany bar, well populated by relaxed locals and weary travelers alike. "Get me a ginseng tea and 2 Scotch and sarsaparillas, good friend fellow." The barkeep expertly shook the drinks together, plunked the ginseng into a potful of warm water and slid Barry the whole thing on a tray, nicely arranged. After waiting a proper brew time, he poured some tea in the small cup and sipped. "Not half bad," he said. "My compliments. Say, what's the word on the rumble taking place in the big town of these parts a few days from now?" "Well met to you, friendo, and I'm sure it's a pleasure to be of service in providing you with drinks. We are known for our magnanimity after all, here in Confluence Gulch. But what gives with this line of questioning? What business do you have around here? I warn you that you could develop a reputation as a nosy meddler with behavior like this. Why should you, a stranger who's not from around here, be trusted? See here. I know you're a busy man, what with all these patrons and the evening just begun. But spare me a moment so that things may be made clear to me on one point. Have I gone insane, or is it everybody else?" "How do you mean, friend?" The barkeep polished a glass, the eternal privilege of his profession. The hopefully sanitary rag audibly squeaked against the glass interior. "The rumble is common knowledge. This is not controversial. but I might go so far as to say that it's uncommonly common knowledge. In this day and age, with the trend of people becoming more sedentary and traveling primarily for reasons of business or personal import, the West Pueblo's megarumble is attracting unusual press, bringing people from all around and about the area and, indeed, the nation. After all, it's known that the roster should be excellent. It might be the news story of the year for West Pueblo City. And yet, when I ask locals about it in a manner which I thought was clearly indicative of small talk and light banter, it's as if I asked them for state secrets and the combination to their family's jewelry vault. The barkeep laughed magnanimously, even though he wasn't actually being magnanimous about anything, since the prices on drinks weren't even that great. I see. You foreign strangers from different parts who, I'm sorry to say and don't think me rude, have ways different from our own and don't know what it's like. You foreigners probably go around saying indiscriminate things to one another for a sort of perverse, decadent gossip pleasure. I respect your ways, on account of my liberality. You'll just know, now that we've had this talk, not to meddle in the future when you haven't even proven yourself trustworthy. So I will, fine fellow, my good friend. I fully submit to your judgment. A lovely evening to you. And with a sigh and a roll of the eyes, Barry finished his tea and carried the drinks back to the friends. How do you talk to these people? He asked Sal. The only way I know how, said San. Rarely. The fiddler exploded into a dramatic fiddle solo that drew the odd clap. That fiddler, San observed, is going to be fiddling around with himself well into the night. By which time I hope to be well on my way to Club Bazaar, said Barry. True, agreed Sal. I complain about having to listen to the academic narcissists that drop in, but there really is some kind of an advantage that a club in a dream has over any club in the waking world. It's as if clubs belong in and to dreams. Once you've been to Club Bazaar, these saloons of earth are the ones that start to feel strangely out of place. I'm finding, said Drip Dry, that I have this strange sensation listening to what you're saying. I couldn't agree more, and yet my head feels funny at the same time. Welcome to arcane knowledge, said Barry. Man, said Pardoilios. I really would like to be able to do this Moon Club thing, with how handy it is for keeping in touch and things, but listen, I don't picture myself ever being able to get to where I can handle it. I know it's just normal to you guys, but to me it's just way too strange. I ain't smart enough by half. From across the crowded saloon, there was a thunderous bellow. I hear there is an outsider who would meddle in our affairs. Where is he? Show yourself. That's definitely gonna be me, said Barry, rising from his stool. 20 Desiccation and Desperation. The crowd parted, and the sight that greeted Barry strained credulity. Yet he witnessed it with his naked eyes. The great big ninny hammer was stomping to and fro in frantic consternation. His body was nearly as wide as his considerable height, with big arms and massive hands that looked perfectly suited for using a tree as a weapon, if there had been any around. At all points along his person, small cacti were affixed. Barry was admiring the cleverness of using this as armor, when he realized these small cacti were affixed to the lout by poking into his flesh. He had a big, round head with bulging cheeks and a flat cranium. Atop the cranium, a disconcertingly stunning display of lovely succulence seemed to be thriving. The man was the embodiment of anger, yet he showed no visible pain at having 1,000 small cacti jab their needles into his flesh. Barry couldn't help but notice, with anguish, that there was even a cacti, in the region, of his groin. The fiddling stopped. You, outsider. Explain yourself. Defend your actions to a proud tribesman. I am Fred, warrior of the Succulentites. This is our land. Our heritage. Our way of life. Why do you want to destroy that? You come here thinking you deserve our knowledge. But you are untrustworthy. The Succulentites are not fooled by your words. We have no need for outsider talk and the tricks of meddlers. It is up to me to punish your disrespect. And punish it I will. So say no more, and fight me like a man. While the mad patron was blabbering, Barry had been focusing. Now, his body was halfway towards being metal hard. But he could still barely move. He had been training assiduously at night, but he wasn't there yet. It was really tough to move after your skin was metallized, one of the most prized techniques in alchemical physical training, even. If transmutation were easy, Barry reflected, even people like this spiny lout could do it, with the proper diet, a thought which made his skin crawl. He closed his eyes and focused. Then, before the hardening completed, he used all his energy to say, in a quiet voice, "Come get me, big boy. You mock your last mock, meddling fool." The big man charged, arms out and at the ready, plainly intent on grappling. Like a rhinoceros, cacti spines flouncing, he came, with the fierce inevitability of a freight train. Barry stood stock still and placid. Fred slammed into him, wrapping his arms around him and bringing him to the ground. He sat on top of Barry and began mercilessly pummeling him. He looked down. There were broken cacti spines all over the tiled floor. In frustration, he picked Barry up, raised the rigid body above his head like a sledgehammer, and brought Barry headfirst down onto the tiles, which shattered and scattered in a cloud of dust on impact. He brought his giant cactus-sandaled foot down onto Barry's head, driving it further into the ground and causing another shower of broken needles. He then did likewise with his other foot. Finally, the man jumped into the air as far as he could manage, not very far, and landed on Barry with a reverberating belly flop. Needles absolutely blanketed the floor, scattering hither and yon. Good, thought Barry. Everything's going according to plan. The nitwit got up and turned to the crowd. Congratulations to me. I have dealt with the meddler. What a relief. Now we should have no more outsiders meddling in our affairs, for now at least. Everyone can go back to drinking in peace. The man almost sounded normal now that his outrageous adrenaline was leveling back down with the perception of the threat being clear. There were scattered applause, and people began to turn back to their drinks. The fiddler was on the verge of starting back up. Barry stood up. I was killed by this guy just now. But Fidge gave me a second chance. Isn't that great? It's definitely a miracle. These superstitious idiots should definitely believe such a line. They were probably totally unaware of the developments in alchemical physical training that were going on in the wide world these days. Sure enough, there were a few gasps. Hey, that's great. Confluence Gulch is the place for miracles by Fidge, all right. I bet he was never meddling to begin with. Rumors can get so out of hand. But there was one skeptical face. The succulentite tribesman was trying to look neutral, but Barry spotted a slight scowl, even if only briefly. Maybe. But it's possible he just got lucky. Miraculous things can happen in battle, without actually being holy miracles. Tell you what, everybody. Let me just wrestle him a bit more to make sure it wasn't a fluke. He cracked his cacti-clad knuckles. Barry strode into range before the guy was ready. Now, he began plucking the cacti off the man's flesh. It was possible to do it quickly without implement, thanks to almost all the needles facing outwards having been broken. Barry just plucked like he was plucking fruit, but so rapidly the spectators' eyes could barely follow. The effects were robustly unappetizing. The flesh beneath the cacti was soft and pink, including the groin flesh. Very unappealing. Very, very, very unappealing. From each area of removal, small rivulets of too viscous fluid seeped slowly. One was a dark red, diseased trickle of old blood like you might get from a particularly nasty zit when freshly popped. The other was an unhallowed green suppuration it was well not to contemplate. Except for this horrible factor, the effect of the removal of all the cacti from Fred's front gave the impression that he had just recently received a bikini waxing, but his entire body was the bikini area. Nude in front and with cacti still stuck in back, he looked rather silly. He also didn't look like a happy camper. It looked like he was sick to his stomach. This feeling was shared by everyone in the saloon, due to the unbelievable aroma wafting from the newly exposed flesh, like 1,000 hot and naked roadkill fresh from an intimate tete-a-tete with a vat of boiling cactus oil. 6 patrons fainted, an impressively low number that spoke to the hardiness of these people. Well, maybe we can fight some other time, there's been enough excitement for tonight anyway, wouldn't wanna look a gift miracle in the mouth. His face turned green, his eyes rolled around in his head. I think I'm gonna go have a lie down now. Bye bye, he turned and trudged away, stooped under the weight of his back cacti. Barry nodded. And may the light of fit shine upon you, good succulentite comrade. There was a small smattering of appreciative chuckles and applause. The fiddling started back up. Fred looked back for one forlorn moment. Then he wandered out the door and perhaps off to a better, more caring place, where he could rest and relax free from the concerns of meddlers. He'll need rest, if he's to face the world. We all do, from time to time, don't we? And the fearsome foursome of travelers drank their drinks, and talked of what they might do. Once they arrived in West Pueblo City and found some free time, and generally, they enjoyed one another's company. And they got some quick suppers, and as Barry predicted, they were quite good. And they enjoyed the homey ambience. And the saloon filled even further. And the fiddler fiddled with himself. Into the night. Well, into the night. It was a world in which little changed. And to those who loved it, that was good. The group headed out at the crack of dawn. Pardoilios complained about not getting any huevos rancheros, but the kitchen wouldn't even be open for another hour. Barry and Drip Dry were itching to get to West Pueblos, to get to where the action was. 2 solid days, said Barry, without pussyfooting, and we'll be there. In the dream world, Marcel had said that the group had arrived, bedraggled and exhausted, but with enough money for an inn. Everyone would meet at the Desiccated Lizard Inn, the most ragged, disheveled, and inexpensive lodging within city limits. Nobody had any interest in spending more money than was necessary, with the future, financial and otherwise, so uncertain. The terrain became more uneven. Occasionally, there would be low spots with long flat stretches. The vegetation was, occasionally, almost lush, with yucca to spare. The cart creaked and rattled. Pardoilios, ever the steady driver, was never complaining, but the bumps made him belch and fart up a storm. San spent most of the drive with her eyes closed. Barry and Drip Dry looked out the window. Habitations were less uncommon off the road, but this was still a rugged region, and besides West Pueblo City, only a few other towns of any size existed in the southwestern region. There just wasn't enough water, in most areas, to sustain a larger population. Even as they approached civilization, the feeling was still one of wilderness, if not quite as deep. Barry wondered where the exact line between civilization and wilderness was. If there were 9 square blocks of undeveloped land in the middle of a city, and almost nobody ever went into it, was it wilderness? Maybe not. But why not? How big would it have to be? How few people would have to go into it? There were hiking trails in what was called wilderness that got more foot traffic than some city streets. They slept in the wagon for one last night, the only night for San, of course. At dawn, stiff in all their joints, they stretched out, ate some canned beans, and headed straight onwards down a gassy road paved with morning farts. I never knew, said San, just how bad it could be. Despite being closer to town, the path seemed to get bumpier. Barry kept expecting the rattling to die down as they headed to what surely must have been a more well-traveled route, into the city. The speed mules were palpably missing the troughs and oats of Confluence Gulch. But they soldiered on, seeming to divine by some road-honed speed mule sixth sense that they were approaching a respite, and that flagging now would only keep them from getting there sooner. The cart was now creaking in earnest. "I'll see to selling it for scrap when we get in," said Drip Dry. "I'm sure glad we have the main cart from your T-Town group." Barry knew that with San, there would be just enough space to fit everyone comfortably, assuming there weren't any more defections. The dream of having 2 carriages was over before it had begun. Finally, the city came into view. Barry marveled. Pardoilios belched. San kept her eyes closed, absorbed in who knew what meditations. "West Pueblos," said Drip Dry, gazing out the window. "I knew I'd see you again one day." The city had originally been in the rock corridor between 2 unusually close mesas. Now it had spread far out on either end of the corridor, and even spread tentative fingers onto the tops of the massive mesas. Tier upon tier of adobe structures was stacked in the most artful manner, with courtyards, drainage systems, and flourishes like glass domes and ornate antennae. Towers here and there. The people of West Pueblos preferred their adobe walls mostly plain, as they found this to be in the best taste. But in places, perhaps more for the benefit of visitors than anything else, there were beautiful paintings on the outer walls facing the city entrance. They featured historic events such as the city's founding and some famous battles of the area, as well as mythical themes, like the flight of the Desiccation Council's sky god, Yahweh Dazzler. This close to the rumble, the group was finally seeing a crowd on the road into town. Last-minute travelers were starting to show up. They were saved from being caught in a traffic jam by the fact that, to reach the desiccated lizard, they were heading towards the slums. Of necessity, most of the inns of West Pueblos were on the outskirts of the city, so that the stables could be attached, it being extremely dense within town. In an attempt to keep the traffic under control in the few first-floor streets wide enough for a carriage to fit in, city zoning ordinances made it prohibitively difficult to build any stabling-type structure very far into town. The carriage was now moving towards the slope of the northern mesa, and graffiti of a more slumly sort was becoming more and more in evidence, the closer the group came. Taggers were afoot in the West Pueblo slums. The barking of pitbulls and rottweilers was audible, revealing the security measures of slum dwellers with outward-facing walls. Barry doubted it would be practical to keep such an animal too far into the cramped confines of town. The weather-beaten desiccated lizard sign was the type that had a row of small blinking colored light bulbs around its perimeter, in a skinflint attempt to replicate the allure of neon. The rectangle of rust-black metal didn't go well with the colors, the light bulbs were too small and not bright enough, and almost half of them had gone out or were on the fritz, blinking fitfully. But they'd made such good time, it was only starting to get dark. Maybe the effect was better later, though if Barry was outside the slum walls in the dark, with the howling of coyotes on one side and the vicious barking on the other, he guessed he wouldn't be too concerned with how any signs looked. The speed mules, now sensing they were near enough to their destination, had allowed themselves to decelerate a bit, and the cart was trundling along, within throwing distance of the inn stables. Pardoilios prepared to goad the dragging animals towards the door. Before he could commit a single goading, the carriage collapsed about them. They sat for a moment on their seat cushions, looking at the open air all around, abject and stunned. "I guess we'll just get the speed mules settled and carry our stuff on in," said Barry. "You know what," said San, "that cart was really a piece of shit." The saloon was dim and dismal. Classic rock played at a muffled volume, the bass humming toothlessly. The crew dragged themselves through the door, loaded down with their packs. The odor was like the worst brand of cigarettes in any dimension. Perhaps the scruffy dude who leaned scowling behind the reception desk was smoking one of these obscene atrocities, sending up filthy coils of smoke like the excrescences of the beast, even now. Perhaps that was how he got that scruffy. A nearby spittoon didn't aid the odor at all. Barry declaimed, "I've had enough saloons for several lifetimes." The sullenness of his comrades spoke of assent. Barry's energy rose. At a filthy table, the remaining T-Town posse were playing cards. It was just as Marcel had said, there was Tobias, Flunky, and the 6 elders. Who could have guessed, when the expedition had started out, that T-Town wrestling would be decimated before it was close to halfway? It was unprecedented. But now, he saw his traveling comrades, and it renewed something he hadn't known needed renewing. He approached, dragging his gear. "Fellows, have you been waiting long?" Tobias beamed. "Barry, dear friend. When you made that suggestion, what seems like an eternity ago, I couldn't have guessed the wild places it would lead. But no, we haven't waited long. Your group has made excellent time. And can my eyes deceive me?" Tobias' face lit up like a forest full of Yule trees. "Is Drip Dry Eyes traveling with you?" Barry nodded. "Barry, you've truly done it. You managed to bag us a wrestling legend who's eclipsed by none, not even Jayhawk himself. I don't know if I can express to a non-fan just how important Drip Dry Eyes is to the sport. The word legend is inadequate. He's one of the greatest who ever lived. Barry turned and saw that the rest of the group had wandered over to the table. Drip Dry was looking down at the card game. Suddenly, a look crossed his face. "Oh, Barry," he said, "I just remembered. I forgot something in the cart." He put a hand on Barry's shoulder, applying the slightest of pressures. "I think I better go in the cart and look at it." Barry looked down ever so slightly. Drip Dry's thumb, at his side, was pointing very slightly outward, in a natural-seeming way. It was pointing towards Flunky. I might have known it, Barry thought. Flunky. That guy always did seem a bit too buddy-buddy, without there ever being much genuine warmth to it. But he kept his head down and made himself useful. A very clever strategy. I wonder who he's a spy for? Outwardly, his face remained totally passive. Drip Dry stepped away. His traitor detection ability was famous, but Flunky had made no attempt to hide himself. Drip Dry's hand pressure indicated he detected no nervousness. Even if Flunky had felt so confident of whatever plans he had that he wasn't concerned being found out would jeopardize them, there should at least be the background human nervousness at having one's identity discovered and monitored, at being found to be a phony. This meant that he probably didn't know that Drip Dry had genuine powers of character detection. In other words, that it was all wrestling kid stuff made up for entertainment value. But they had planned out in Club Bazaar, if and when a traitor was detected, Drip Dry should find an immediate excuse to abscond from the group, not spending time to give the traitor a chance to wonder if there really was nothing to the stories. If they had skepticism in the abilities to begin with, they almost certainly wouldn't think they could work that quickly, that effectively. At least, that was the hope. "Oh. I know the ones you're talking about. Let me put my stuff up, and I'll help you out. But I'm looking forward to catching up with you guys. We'll get checked in, and then start making plans for our wrestling takeover." The T-Town boys raised their mugs to that, big smiles on their faces. Barry leaned over to Tobias. "And we've gotta do some special planning on tag team coordination. Maybe we should have an executive meeting soon." San plunked her luggage sack down. The room was bare bones, but plenty of space for the four of them, exactly what was wanted. The cigarette smell was less up here, thanks to small windows, a pot of ancient, withered plants that acted as potpourri, and the luck of no smokers having stayed in it recently. Yet the smell was ingrained into the wall. It wouldn't fully disappear until the inn did. Barry moved the plain table to the center of the room. There was a knock. "Come in," said Drip Dry. It was Tobias and Marcel. "The rest of the group is drinking themselves stupid," said Marcel, getting all hyped up about wrestling. "Sometimes I think those guys are idiots." "I know what you mean," said Barry. "Turns out they were never worth much. But our issue at this executive meeting is with Flunky. Specifically, what we're gonna do with him." Tobias sat down heavily. "I'm utterly lost. What's the meaning of all this?" Marcel explained the dream meetings, and the plan for what to do if Drip Dry Eyes detected traitors. If I had said anything, it might have been overheard and compromised the whole plan. There was no time when we had any privacy. "This is too much to take in," said Tobias. "I never noticed Flunky doing anything suspicious the whole time we've traveled with him. That guy has been a fixture of T-Town wrestling for years." "Does anyone know his real name?" asked Barry. "Well, no. Now that you mention it, Flunky is an odd ring name." San frowned. "I don't know or care about T-Town wrestling, but only one kind of person would willingly call themselves Flunky Anarch. This has Central Gov written all over it." "Agreed," said Drip Dry, pulling up a chair, flipped it backwards, sitting down with his elbows leaning against it. "It's no surprise," he said, "that you wouldn't detect him, Tobias, is it?" "A pleasure to meet you. Barry has told me good things." "It's no surprise. Years working in the industry will bring you into contact with all kinds of finks, especially if you've spent time at the top. Besides my cultivated character detection abilities, all veteran pros can detect certain things. And in that capacity, I take this Flunky guy to be an espionage pro. Our best bet is probably gonna be direct confrontation in a setting where he's ganged up on. I have a two-pronged strategy. Tobias, if you can be the lookout. 21 Would you like some cheese with that wine?" The T-Town elders staggered down the hallways of the gritty inn. "We gonna bust some heads. Nobody and ready for T-Town havoc." They muttered drunkenly to themselves and one another as they bumped into potted plants, soda and ice machines, crummy hotel paintings, the doors to other people's rooms. "We gonna bust 'em up good. Blah." Flunky followed close, only slightly less inebriated. Tobias was not far behind him. They finally found their room, began stumble in one by one. It was the other large room the inn had on offer. There was no competition among visiting wrestlers to stay at the Desiccated Lizard. The group was stuffed in the room, but still found ways to sprawl in their drunken blackout states, draping themselves awkwardly over every available surface. Tobias put his hand on Flunky's shoulder. He whispered, "Hey, the guys feel bad about making you babysit the rest of the group during our exec meeting. Come say hi. They said to visit in their room before we all went to bed." "Feels bad? Is nothing to feel bad about. I'm just Flunky Dash. You haven't even been properly introduced yet. Come on, they wanna meet you. They might be about to fall asleep, we'll see if they even open the door." Nightcap. "Do wanna meet the new guys? What about this Drip Dry Eyes catch, huh? What a coincidence. I almost wonder." "Me too," Tobias hazarded. "We should scope things out." He guided Flunky out the door. "I'm sure they won't wanna talk long. You know how early Barry gets to sleep. The rest are probably just as bad." "Gotta check out the action. Friendly friends. Wonder if Drip he's just a washed up guy. Probably out of touch. Well, we'll get him going. Time to get your keep earned, tough boys. We're gonna earn the T-Town name. Let's scoop the scoop, scoop the gangs all out." Flunky was drunker than Tobias had thought. Gotta scoop out the friends. Do a knee drop. Wonder if there's still time. Get the T-Town name ta together. We go in ta get tha tough. Fight. Flunky began to punch the door to another room. Tobias quickly guided him on. It was getting harder to control Flunky's direction. His knees would buckle and shoot off at unpredictable angles. "Look," said Tobias, "that's the room there, at the end of the hallway. I wonder if they've got any more scotch stashed in there." "Scotch," Flunky drawled lovingly as he picked up his pace. "For Waheen you're one a free gird. Has." He goose-stepped wildly down the rest of the way, opened the door. San grabbed his wrist as he stepped through the door. Drip Dry came from the other side, grabbed his other wrist. Flunky turned his head back and forth wildly in confusion, eyes bulging. San and Drip Dry pulled him forward. His legs buckled. The forward motion continued unabated, his legs dragging behind. Barry was waiting for him. He grabbed Flunky, power slamming him into the room's sole table, which crashed apart. "We can just say it was termites," said Marcel hopefully. Flunky's mouth opened fish-like in a silent gasp for air. He was 200% more sober. "Listen up, you piece of garbage," said Barry in a deadpan. "We've found the real stuff." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Flunky. "What real stuff?" "You know exactly what he's talking about," said Drip Dry. "You and your bosses probably thought," Barry went on, "that the famous Drip Dry eyes smell technique of sniffing out a man's character was just some sort of kiddie nonsense dreamt up by wrestling promoters. Because you never really cared about wrestling. Your infiltration was expertly done. Of course, the central government would know that something as wild and free as wrestling would be a perfect meeting point for those who wished to thwart their plans and keep them underground. Wrestling is a common ground for the mighty every man and every woman, the good old wholesome all-around knightly kind with a pure, free-spirited joie de vivre and a gusto for sportsmanlike conduct and clean living. Such as these will always be the enemies of your machinations wherever they rear their putrid little necks." "Preach," said San. "How many more like you are there," demanded Drip Dry, "in towns across these United States?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "It's no use," said Barry, "and by that I mean it really is no use. I hate that we have to do this. It's some real sicko stuff, invading a guy's dreams. But if you don't talk, and I bet you won't, you'll leave us no choice. We have Tobias here." Tobias smiled awkwardly. "He's our guard." "Well, you're temporarily sobered by all this excitement. But you've drunk a lot. And you just had a bit of a fall. You're not gonna stay conscious much longer. Remember the executive meeting? About 10 minutes of that was us explaining our plan to Tobias. The rest was him napping, so that he could keep an awake guard here all night, if needed. You know the flask he was drinking from? It didn't have scotch in it. It had ginseng tea. The rest of us are almost as sleepy as you are. And when you knock off, we'll follow you into your dream. We'll see about that. I have more willpower than you might think." "Good," said Drip Dry. "I hoped you'd say something like that. Because struggling will wear you out. But it doesn't matter. My nose abilities are real. I can sense your fatigue. Barry is right. We will follow you into dreams. I won't even be applying my Boston Crab on you right now, though that's still on the table." Flunky lifted his head slightly, looked around bleary-eyed. "Fair? What's fair fighting sportsmanlike conduct about this? What's so white knight noble about apprehending a guy that you have no proof against, no reason to even suspect, who's done nothing against you, done everything for you? Barry." He looked into Barry's cool, unswerving eyes. "Barry, you're the guest here. I've done everything for you. But I've been doing this for years. You're the upstart. And you come in, and you attack me, and throw abuse at me, and false accusations. And you've got your friends in on it. And your proof is what?" His neck swiveled painfully towards Drip Dry. Drip Dry eyes. "I think you've really lost touch. You're allowing this unproven, faulty sense you say you have, to make you judge, jury and executioner in this mob of vigilante justice. What am I even accused of? Is there even one solid accusation against me, much less a piece of evidence? This is madness." He let his head drop back down. "Good," said Drip Dry. "Use up that energy." "You're filth, Flunky," said Barry. "Always were. I knew it when you were disrespectful of Torval after that plant ate him. Anyone can make a mistake, even a really big one. but nobody was closer to you than Torval. When I saw how you acted after I put you in your place, how reserved you were without any show of contrition, how cleanly and efficiently you hid your emotions without any signs of strength of character, I thought, there's something wrong with this guy. But shock can make people act strange, and I waited to see how you acted later. It never changed. Anyone that's subservient is up to no good. Nobody liked you, yet you asked for nothing. What did you get out of wrestling? You were past the point where you might have just been a chump, thinking a late career break was coming to them. Let's face it. You were always competent at best. Yet you gave everything to the sport, without a trace of passion, and nobody knew anything about you. Well, that's about to change, scumbag. Your days of slinking are over. We're gonna break you wide open. The last sentence barely registered on a conscious level. The dog face had been right. Flunky found himself getting incredibly sleepy. He'd drank too much. Well, he knew alchemists could have some peculiar tricks. He'd seen what Barry could do in the ring. And the big old lady looked like she might know some Wiccan moves, judging by the hat. But he doubted if the group could actually get much out of him in dreams. That was giving them too much credit. Flunky was, he realized, already asleep. Great. The rest of the group would be falling asleep too, except for Tobias. He obviously didn't understand what was going on here. Marcel, the rare pest walker that actually had some expertise, would have the know-how to travel in dreams. But Tobias must lack the imagination. That was why they left him as lookout. All Flunky had to do was wake himself up quickly. He could use reasoning language on Tobias and fool him easily into going against the group. Then, perhaps, Flunky could make an escape, and get to the West Pueblo City base with what he'd gained. Nobody could track him. They wouldn't have hold of his dreams for long once he was out of their clutches. At least, he hoped they wouldn't. How did this dream magic work? Would they now have access to the dream location of his sleeping self whenever he turned in for the night? He didn't have time to worry about that right now. He rushed towards the light. And was suddenly blocked by the figure of the witch, now completely naked. He swerved, attempting to go around her. Drip-dry eyes loomed into view, less distinct but also much larger. He swerved again. There was Barry, visible with the same fidelity of image as the witch. In his slumbering mind state, Flunky panicked. He rushed headlong towards Barry, but dodged out of his grip. He rushed. He was rushing headlong. Adrenaline had taken over. The survival instinct was at the wheel. He didn't know what he was doing anymore. He rushed. Somehow he was still going, still moving towards Barry's serious eyes, without being caught by his steely grip. He rushed. He was rushing, headlong, into Barry's mind. Arid desert night. Pardoilios was asleep by the fire. Barry and Drip-Dry sat looking into the distance, listening to the howl of coyotes. Drip-Dry shuffled, threw his empty bean can into the blaze. He turned to look at the carriage, parked nearby. "Let's get Ol Pard back into the wagon," he said. "No training tonight. I know you're excited about developing your new technique, but we need to keep our rest up to avoid getting worn down." Barry continued to look out, as if he hadn't heard. "Drip-Dry. Why did you let me win that match on the boardwalk?" Drip-Dry rolled his eyes. "Not this again." Barry continued looking out, his gaze unswervingly focused on the distance. "I can never be at the top of the wrestling game. I just don't have the body for it. If I keep this up, I'm bound to hit the ceiling. The hope is to find Jazzy Jayhawk and fight him before that happens. But you've been out of practice for years, and you could have defeated me. I practically just started wrestling. I won't be able to get enough training and experience to give Jayhawk the match he deserves. And then, I hope to put the whole sordid wrestling business behind me. This is not something that I was made for. This is not my place. It never could be. You don't need to pull any punches. For me, wrestling's just a means to an end. Drip Dry looked right at him. And do you really care about those mushrooms? Barry continued looking into the distance. Drip Dry looked right at him. Well, what do you care about? What's your place? I may not be an art aficionado. But who could forget the early work of Barry when it first premiered? I did visit Gastizo Island, both on tour, and on vacation, when it was still above water. Paganina used to insist on going gallery hopping. I couldn't understand anything that was going on in most of the art she so loved. But the beauty in one set of works caught even my untrained eyes. It was the pride of the island, the Barry portraits. We would pay them a visit every time we went there. After a few days of travel, I put two and two together and recognized you as that Barry, the one who made such great and promising early works. And then, just as you got your artistic momentum going, there was no follow-up. If you had continued developing what you had, you could have met Jazzy Jayhawk by now on that basis alone. So what gives? If you're so concerned with being in your proper place, then why are you out here fighting? Why not get back and really come to grips with your painting, really capture that old magic? Barry turned. Drip Dry. I know you probably don't talk to too many creatives. But have you ever heard of someone like me, who did a scant handful of significant works in their youth and then made nothing of importance for the rest of their life, really talk seriously, in detail, about why that is? No, I haven't. Why don't you hear that? It's a good question. Barry put his head down briefly. When he lifted it, it had the same steely gaze. It's hopeless to talk about it. You can't and won't be able to describe to anyone else what it's like. To really communicate something. To show people another way of seeing things. And then, to lose that magic, to be unable to do it again. And you go on with your boring life. You know about lifestyle artists, right? The people who barely made any art in the first place, but go on living in artist communities for the feeling they get. It's incomprehensible. Why would anyone choose to live like that, in pointless poverty? But you look around one day, and realize that you've become no different from these people. So you distance yourself from the community. You have nothing for it. It has nothing for you. You dive into normal life, into obscurity. Idiots say that artists are like whores and exhibitionists. When you don't have a good work to show, some way to broaden people's horizons, you dive into the luxury of obscurity with gusto. The artists you hear about who keep their career going after their creativity has dried up, it's purely financial. They're laughing all the way to the bank. They're only jealous of the obscurity. But losing that ability, that artistic fire, is like losing a sense of sight. It's like losing the ability to fly. Why don't you hear old artists talk about it? Why don't you make work that has the fire of when you were younger? That is the most despised question. The most despised. I can't tell you the pain that question makes me feel. In a proud land like the United States, with our powerful independence and free-spiritedness, I'm afraid that nobody can understand that pain. Now Barry was back at his pad in the forest of T-Town, painting. He was painting a stock alchemical diagram. He plopped some color here, a flourish there. It was relaxing. But there was an emptiness in his eyes. There was something morbid, something self-pitying, about making these insignificant little paintings. Pang. These were pangings. He put down the last color, smiled wanly, wiped off his brush, and turned to his bedside table, where a cup of tea waited. He sipped, and went to sleep. He was on Gastizo Island again. Morgo was sitting on the cot in their little hut. We have to get off this island, Barry said. The typhoon is coming. A drowning death is not in the cards for us. Come on. I will carry you out of here by force. Morgo was defiant. Get to the boat, Barry. You don't have much time left. My magic, my very life force, is wrapped up in this island. I can't leave. You'll drown. Morgo looked down at her feet. Barry. You have your whole life in front of you. I'm done. This is madness. In a frenzy, Barry grabbed Morgo by the waist, lifting her up. He strode out the door, spotting the boat in the distance. Stragglers were crowding on, the last call. He began rushing, realized that he wasn't carrying anyone anymore. He looked back to the cottage. No one was inside. He looked around. Curses. Curses. It was witch magic again. If only he knew some kind of alchemy, any magical ability, he might have thwarted this. He went back to the hut, looked inside, looked around the back, peered in all directions. She was invisible. If she didn't want to be found. The boat's horn honked a last call. Tears welled in his eyes. She did things like this. Surely she would regain her senses. She would probably be on the boat by the time he got there, The image of Morgo flitted in front of him as he walked up the gangplank. Life is a dream sequence, she whispered to him. This explains its inconsistencies.